Hello, I'm Julia Jessen, Curator of Collections and Exhibitions at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. Thank you for joining me today for this Grant Wood in Focus presentation. This is a series of Zoom presentations that we do at the CRMA, looking at various aspects of Grant Wood's life and career. Today, I'll be focusing on the artworks Grant Wood created for books. Literary influence was very present for Grant Wood. His creative circle in the 1930s involved many writers, and it was those local writers, as well as other authors from the Midwest, more so than visual artists, that gave him a sense of how he could create his art, focusing on the Midwest while also living in the area. Local Iowan writer J. Sigmund and Ruth Sakow both influenced Wood and encouraged him to focus his art on the Iowan landscape and people that surrounded him. Later, at the same time that Wood was living in Iowa City and teaching at the University of Iowa, the Iowa Writers' Workshop was being established, and Wood seemed to find more acceptance and support among that literary crowd than he did from his colleagues and the administration of the art department. On a more national scale, in the years leading up to the 30s, a great deal of literature was being produced in the Midwest, and some novelists, like Hamlin Garland, were advocating for authors to write what they knew and tell stories of the people and places that surrounded them. The early decades of the 1900s were also a time when society broadly, and writers more specifically, were focusing more on the state of the Midwest and worrying about a loss of individual local character as cities and industrialization grew. Some argued that unique Midwestern communities, as well as other regions throughout the US, were just as ripe for literary attention and inspiration as areas that were thought of as being more cosmopolitan, like the East Coast and Europe. Wood was aware of this discourse, and he was grappling with how his own art fit into this discussion. That is some of the literary context leading up to and existing in this period that Grant Wood would have been familiar with, and a little bit of how it impacted him, and to an extent created the right set of circumstances for Wood to conceive of his art as regionalist and really lean into an art of Iowa and the Midwest. But Wood also created specific works for books themselves. The artworks that we'll talk about today were all created after American Gothic, the work you're seeing on your screen, and his success with that work. And this is kind of unusual. It was not typical for well-known artists to accept so many commissions for this type of work. Wood viewed these commercial commissions as a way to reach a broad public while simultaneously earning income. At points where he had a lot going on in his life that was distracting him from art making, and he was experiencing drops in creativity, having these commissioned illustration projects allowed him to continue working and producing art while perhaps not having to utilize as much focused attention and concentration on the work. However, that's not to say that these works aren't still thoughtful, clever, and detailed. One such type of bookish commission was the book cover. In the early 1930s, Wood created the book jacket, this book jacket image for regional author Vardis Fisher's In Tragic Life, and its sequel, Passions Spin the Plot, in 1932 and 1933, respectively. The series was semi-autobiographical, and in the first novel, In Tragic Life, the author explores childhood traumas in his isolated Mormon settlement hometown in Idaho, his personality disorders, and grapples with his own sense of himself as a writer. Wood's cover reflects this dark and chaotic theme with a cacophony of illustrated heads, animal forms, and objects rising out of a dark background. The adolescent protagonist dominates the left side of the scene, his eyes wide and wild, and his long, somewhat unnatural hands resting on either side of his face. The many people, animals, and objects depicted behind him seem to reflect a troubled and conflicted mind overwhelmed by memory. The depiction is a bit surreal, perhaps reflecting the style that some American painters were then working in. The following year, Wood created the cover image for Vardis Fisher's sequel to In Tragic Life, Passions Spin the Plot. In the book, the protagonist, Vidar, sees his wife Neola as vacillating between good and evil, a duality represented in the cover that Wood created. Wood enlisted the help of Florence Sprague, the sculpture instructor at the Stone City Art Colony, to create 2 plaster busts based off of Wood's sketches of a student. Wood joined the busts together in his final image, one side seeming pure and innocent, the other vulgar, garish, and immoral. The features of this double bust depiction are somewhat classical, with wide eyes and strong contours. These were sort of odd commissions for Wood in their subject matter and depiction, but he would go on to do additional book cover work for other authors and volumes. Sterling North's Plowing on Sunday tells the story of an independent Wisconsin farmer living on the land in the years before World War I. In his cover image, Wood depicts the protagonist with a finger hooked through the handle of an earthenware jug, taking a swig while he holds the reins taut in his right hand. Wood's depiction differs from how the main character, Stud Brailsford, is described in the book, and instead some of his features may be stylized versions of Wood's own features. Plowing on Sunday feels somewhat similar to Wood's self-portrait of 1932, in which he appears wearing overalls next to a windmill. The plowman in Plowing on Sunday, while sharing some similarities with Wood, doesn't have specific features and details, and instead becomes a representation of the everyman farmer. Although the piece and the novel it was for are titled Plowing on Sunday, the plow does not appear. Instead, it is suggested by the reins held in the figure's right hand, which seem to merge with the lines indicating the fields and horizon behind it, reinforcing the connection between the farming implement and the land. Wood would utilize a similar plowman figure, this time with a full-scale scene around him, in his central panel for Breaking the Prairie Sod at the Iowa State University Library. In that depiction, the figure still drinks from a water jug, but his plow and resting team of horses are now visible. Wood's interest in rural subjects continues with his cover illustration for Iowan author Thomas Duncan's O Chautauqua from 1935. Duncan had spent summers traveling throughout the Midwest with a Chautauqua theatrical group. In this period, these groups would travel to different towns, presenting lectures, dance and theater performances, music, and other forms of cultural entertainment under large tents. This novel was inspired by those experiences. Grant Wood took an aerial perspective on his scene for the cover illustration, depicting the large tent from above and including a church steeple on the right side of the image. A mass of people crowd together at the tent's entrance, indicating the performance's popularity. The geometric forms of the composition are striking, with the large octagon of the tent and its spoked lines of tethering rope and the sharply pointed triangle of the steeple, seeming to pen in the gathered audience and herd them to the tent's opening. Wood's final book cover commission would come in 1940 with his illustration for the popular history writer Kenneth Roberts' Oliver Wiswell. This book focused on the American Revolution from the perspective of a British loyalist. Wood used a painted costume portrait he had made of his secretary, assistant, and official biographer, Park Renard. Renard wore the wig and robe of an 18th century barrister to match the time period of the story. His eyebrows draw together, making him seem confused or conflicted, again matching the story of the book. Renard's expression could also have something to do with wearing an itchy, uncomfortable wig and costume, or at least that's how one of the anecdotes about this piece goes. In the background, silhouetted redcoats and colonial militiamen face each other in receding battle lines to fill out the composition, frame the central figure, and illuminate his conflicted nature. The perspective of a British loyalist is not the dominant narrative when discussing the American Revolution, but in a way it fits with Wood's own desires to highlight untold aspects of national myths. These 5 book jackets may have been opportunities for Wood to make money while not having to exert too much energy working on the piece, but they also demonstrate his skill at distilling theme and plot into a single image while maintaining his own aesthetic sensibilities and creating a compelling image meant to draw in the reader. During the 1930s, Wood also worked on a couple of more extensive book illustration projects. One of these was Farm on the Hill from 1935 by Madeline Darrow Horn. Horn was the wife of one of Wood's University of Iowa colleagues. Her children's book tells the story of two boys who live in town going to visit their grandparents' farm for the summer, a sort of tale that was very much in Wood's wheelhouse. This commission came at a time when Wood had just had his first solo show in New York City at the Farrargill Galleries. Despite Wood's popularity with the public, the art critics of New York didn't appreciate what they saw as his sentimentality, an obscuring of the real difficulties faced by Midwestern farmers at this time, and his blurring of fine art and illustration, a quality, of course, that would serve him well in the commissions we've been looking at today. Wood's productivity would suffer a bit of a decline after this exhibition, and in the 9 months that followed, he only created the 8 illustrations and multiple animal drawings for the book's end papers for Farm on the Hill. It's possible that the words of the critics stuck with Wood, and he may have regretted agreeing to work on Farm on the Hill's illustrations, as he did refer to it as a, quote, weak moment. Though he may have also agreed in order to give himself time to work on his own book. These illustrations featured character vignettes on, for the most part, a solid and brightly colored background. And they featured the type of characters Wood enjoyed. Grandma sewing, Grandpa eating popcorn, the hired hands doing their chores, and farmyard animals. The book's end papers featured multiple images of different farmyard animals depicted in a highly stylized and witty way, with the background and the animal's contours indicated using a red color, with black used to draw attention to the eye. The designs are graphically strong and readable. In this example from the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art's collection, a donkey and a rabbit are depicted together. The donkey seems to intimidate the rabbit as he leans forward into the rabbit's space, and the rabbit seems to lean back in surprise or fear. The designs are simple, but have a lovely tension to them, and they provide an effective entry point into the story for the reader. And here are just a few details of the image. You'll have to excuse any visible glare or reflection. These also give you a sense of the simple, confident lines Wood used, and how he was able to still give the animal a sense of personality, even with such spare details. The illustrations that accompany the text are idealized representations of typical farm scenes. Charming, stylized representations still manage to convey Wood's wit and attention to detail. In the CRMA's illustration from Farm on the Hill, Hired Girl with Apples, farmhand Cora is peeling apples. To give you a sense of how the images appear within the book in conjunction with the story in the text, here are some images of how Hired Girl with Apples is shown within the pages. The image is preceded by the story it corresponds to, and then it appears on its own on an individual page. The story that accompanies the image is titled The Biggest Meal in the World. A portion of the text reads, "But Cora," asked Bill, "you made 3 apple pies yesterday. Why do you make more today?" Cora was peeling apples. She had on her new blue and white apron. "You wait until tomorrow, Bill, and you'll see why we need more pie," answered Cora. "When you watch the threshers eat, you'll wonder where on earth they put so much food." Bill went to the pantry door and looked at its shelves. "Seems to me this is enough food to feed 100 men," he said to Cora. Never had Bill seen so much food in one pantry. The text goes on to describe in detail just what foods are in the pantry and what food still needs to be made for the meal, while Bill, one of the grandchildren from town, marvels at the amount and the preparation. Wood has incorporated details from the text, like the new blue and white apron, and also worked in his own details, like the pins holding Cora's coiled hair in place. And again, please excuse any glare or reflection. And though it does get somewhat lost in the final printed version, you'll notice here too the blonde eyelashes that Cora has, which are visible as she looks down and they sort of rest on the tops of her cheeks. Wood's additional details, including the strength of the figure's arms, and her hands as she peels the apple, or the apron bow hanging off of the bench, and the sliver of apple peel hanging out of a bowl. They point us around the scene and point us toward the coil that rests on the lower right corner of the stone slab on which the bench rests, fully moving us throughout the picture. Although the figures appear as broad types, these small details help to connect the illustrations to the story and create a more fully realized character. The illustrations seem to have been received favorably. One review of the children's book in the American Magazine of Art commented, "Wood as an illustrator is Wood at his best. His humor design and human commentary all contribute to the success of his series. It is a field to which his talents are well suited, and it is true that the drawings are indeed above the average in originality and craftsmanship." The author follows with only one complaint, that the choice of the orange background paper is unfortunate. Because he had spent time working on these illustrations and his own book, Wood didn't have any paintings to sell at a gallery exhibition the following year. Instead, the gallery featured these illustrations and the farm animal end papers and billed them as decorative designs. The illustrations for Farm on the Hill feel reminiscent of some of Wood's mural projects, with their solid, stocky figures and simplified backgrounds. In particular, the Fruits of Iowa, 6 large farm murals and 1 smaller mural, celebrating the produce and livestock of Iowa, that were originally created for the coffee shop of Eugene C. Epley's Montrose Hotel in Cedar Rapids, and which now belong to Coe College. This farmer from the series feels like he could easily be another illustration for Farm on the Hill. Though large at about 4 feet tall, he wears the uniform we are already familiar with: denim overalls and a playful polka dot shirt. A red handkerchief peeks out of his pocket. Like the illustrations, these figures are part of a cultural type, wearing the garb that distinguishes them and engaged in their typical tasks. Like Farm on the Hill, the figures here are separated out into individual representations set apart from one another. They are romanticized, healthy and strong, cheeks and noses red, and arms tanned from time spent outside in the sun. Plump cheeks and even plumper farm animals, as well as a filled basket of corn, indicate prosperity. The viewer is meant to see their health and vitality as coming from the honest and vigorous job of working the land. The hands, always present and emphasized in each painting, indicate hard but honest work that's worth doing. Again, similar to the emphasis on working with one's hands that we see in Farm on the Hill. Though they could lean too far into a sickly sentimentality, these works again are similar to Farm on the Hill's illustrations in that they retain a sense of humor and cheekiness. The sturdy masculine farmer is balanced by a playful polka dots on his shirt, the delicate daisies on the ground, and surrounded by 2 portly pigs on spindly legs, giving the scene comical storybook qualities. Even more irreverent, given that these murals were created for a space in which people would eat, is the image of the hired hand milking the cow. A patron of the establishment would be confronted with the perfectly symmetrical backside of the cow facing out at them as they tucked into their food. These earlier works clearly demonstrate Wood's interest in depicting these rural types, and doing so with a simple yet detailed and witty style that lent itself well to his future book illustrations. The style that we see here of an idealized and monumental figure would go on to characterize the rest of his mural work, and would lead to Wood being selected as the state director for the Public Works of Art project, also impacting the look of New Deal murals created under the program. By 1935, Wood was booked for nationwide lecture tours to talk about his paintings and regionalism, and his fame had only continued to grow. These new commitments and the increasing demands made it difficult to practice the regionalist vision he espoused, and he was often traveling, sharing regionalism on a national scale. It became very difficult to finish larger projects, and the increasing costs and time demands encouraged him to focus more of his output on prints and illustrations, shorter-term projects that could be accomplished on a smaller time scale while still providing him with compensation. The book project that he would end up spending the most time on was a series of illustrations for Sinclair Lewis's Main Street. Originally published in 1920, Wood was asked in late 1935 to create 9 illustrations for a new edition of the novel, being produced by the Limited Editions Club, a publisher of elaborately produced small-run volumes. Wood worked on these over the course of 15 months. Main Street is a satire of small-town life, and those that both accept the status quo and those that try to change it. The book had been a favorite of Wood's, and the author and the artist had been linked to each other for their similar yet different approaches to small-town life. In fact, William Shire, a journalist from Cedar Rapids, recalled meeting Wood in Paris when the artist was there in the 1920s, shortly before he returned to Iowa, and hearing Wood say he was going home to paint, quote, "those damn cows and barns and barnyards and cornfields and little red schoolhouses and all those pinched faces and the women in their aprons and the men in their overalls. Damn it, isn't that what Sinclair Lewis has done in his writing?" End quote. Lewis, like other writers of the teens and 20s, is one Wood looked to when turning his attention back to the Midwestern subjects of his home region. Despite Wood's admiration and the similarities they shared in subject matter, the two were also very different in how they depicted their subjects. Lewis tended to focus on small town types rather than Wood's more rural subjects. Lewis also often viewed his subjects through a harsher, more critical lens than was Wood's norm. Where Lewis seemed to chafe against the small town, Wood had actively chosen to return to it and focus on those subjects. Wood himself, when he started working on this project, appreciated the care being taken with this edition, and he was actively involved in its creation, helping to choose the book's tan rag paper and the blue and yellow linen binding, which complemented the colors he used in his large preparatory drawings done on brown wrapping paper in pencil, charcoal, crayon, and gouache. He also appreciated the exclusivity of the book. It was limited to a print run of 1,500, with each signed by the artist and printed by the Lakeside Press in Chicago, the same press that had printed a catalog and hosted an exhibition of Wood's work in 1935. Wood created 9 illustrations for the edition, 7 of main characters, and 2 of places within the story. Each illustration was given a generic title to emphasize the small town type represented by the character. The illustrations of settings were used as the frontispiece and the final illustration in the book. A Main Street mansion to open the story, and the village slums to close it. These settings are where most of the action within the book takes place. The protagonists, Carol and Will Kennicott, and their friends live along Main Street in nice houses with modern conveniences. The town radical, the poor farmers, and the immigrants live in the village slums. For the character images, as he often did, Wood asked 7 friends to pose for him, giving each a specific costume and an attribute to indicate their character. There's a photographic snapshot quality to the illustrations with a low perspective and an emphasis on hand gestures and facial expressions that enliven the images, add drama, and enhance the storytelling while revealing the characters' personalities. Wood thought of these not just as illustrations, but rather as standalone works. For the main couple in the story, Carol and Will Kennicott, Carol's attribute is lace curtains, and Will's is a watch. Carol, the main character of the book, is obsessed with bettering the town. She's given the title the perfectionist. Trapped in an unsatisfying marriage, so too is Wood's depiction. In Wood's depiction, is she trapped inside looking out through her lace curtains. From that position, she can observe the town and, enviously, observe the friendly relationships between other couples in the town. Though she is more sympathetic in Lewis's novel, Wood is a bit more critical, emphasizing a search for perfection in others while not recognizing the faults in herself, as represented by the middle button of her dress coming undone. Similarly, while Will Kennicott, the town doctor, is only somewhat likable in Lewis's novel, Wood lends him a more heroic air, depicting only his hands as he takes a man's pulse at his bedside. In the author's text, Will's hands are described as thick and capable here, but in the artist's interpretation, they become slender and skilled. The Kennicott's neighbor, Mrs. Bogart, the good influence, is depicted as a self-righteous and patronizing widow, descending from the Baptist church. Her eyes are narrowed even as she smiles smugly. The text describes her as, quote, her large face with its disturbing collection of moles and lone black hairs, wrinkled cunningly. She showed her decayed teeth in a reproving smile, end quote. Despite representing her with the church to indicate her moral superiority, Wood is able to indicate hypocrisy through the details of her expression. The Booster is a blustering businessman, drumming up support for building a new factory in the town. He is described as a bulky, gauche, noisy, humorous man with narrow eyes, a rustic complexion, large red hands, and brilliant clothes. Wood rounds out the image by adding a Masonic ring, a moose pin, and an American flag. The Booster is seen gesturing strongly as he raises his eyebrows at the viewer, mouth half open in mid-speech, ready to cajole whoever listens into seeing things his way. The sentimental yearner is thought by some to be Wood's interpretation of Guy Pollock, a timid recluse lawyer who dreams of going back to an age of tranquility and good taste. Others think this piece represents Raymond Witherspoon, a professional bachelor and shoe salesman. There are aspects of the work which seem to fit with both characters, and it's also possible that Wood combined both of their characteristics into what he saw as fitting for the idea of the sentimental yearner. The figure appears well-groomed and controlled. He sniffs at a pink carnation but does not show any emotion, instead gazing upward in a dour reverie. The radical handyman, Miles Bjornstam, looks askance, sneering out at the other residents of the Main Street bourgeoisie with his attributes of his tools, including a hammer and sickle. And finally, the practical idealist is Rita Sherwin, an advocate for slow, practical, and measured reform, in contrast to Carol's snap changes. Her attribute is the domestic environment in which she is pictured. She is perhaps the happiest appearing of the figures, giving a sense that she is comfortable with her lot in life and at home within her domestic interior, rather than constantly looking outward, as Carol does. When the edition was published, the response was initially favorable. The St. Louis Dispatch described them as a thoughtful, perhaps even inspired commentary on their own. They are Grant Wood's own conception of American village types, and they are the fruits of his years of concentration on such people. As such, they go a good deal beyond the scope of ordinary illustration and have a place of their own, possibly as prominent as the novel itself. Similarly, guest curator and subsequent director of publications at the Museum of Modern Art, Monroe Wheeler, indicated that he thought the book, quote, may be the most interesting American illustrated book to date, end quote. Later critics would indicate that they felt the complexities of Lewis's characters had been somewhat lost and reduced in Wood's depictions, becoming types rather than fleshed out characters. The illustrations were, of course, simplified to suit their purpose, and they did incorporate more satire than Lewis had initially included in creating and describing the characters. Critics suggested that the works were not able to transcend their boundaries as illustrations. Even the regionalist critic Thomas Craven wrote, quote, it was Wood's custom, after his first literal studies, to refine and rework his conceptions until they were generalized into his own particular family of mortals. To strike, in other words, the golden mean between the actual experience and the abstract pattern. His Main Street personalities are a shade too literal, too close to photographic renderings, end quote. Sinclair Lewis, however, and George Macy, the director of limited editions, both expressed their happiness with the completed project and with Wood's use of his artistic license. So much so that Macy also asked Wood to illustrate a deluxe edition of Edgar Lee Masters' Spoon River anthology, an idea that the author himself also advocated for. Wood would end up turning down this offer as he did not want to interrupt a period of active painting that he was experiencing at the time. The satire Wood employed in the Main Street illustrations was not new to him. Elements of it exist in his previous paintings, such as American Gothic and Daughters of Revolution, and in some of his print work. In Daughters of Revolution, Wood points out the pretensions of the DAR organization in contrast to the heroism of George Washington in Washington crossing the Delaware, pictured behind him. Their pinched faces seem to indicate a narrow-minded worldview. Wood manages to balance calling out specific attitudes and actions of his subjects and gently reprimand them for their narrow-mindedness, while still maintaining an affection and amusement for his neighbors. The satire would continue in some of the works he created for the Associated American Artists, which I'll refer to as AAA. AAA was a very successful New York firm that sold original prints at reasonable prices through mail order catalogs. The company's goal was to provide employment for artists while also making original works available to the general public. Each artist was paid a fee for his work, and the lithographs were printed according to the number ordered, though it was guaranteed that no printing would go beyond 250. Between 1937 and 1941, Wood would make 19 lithographs for AAA. Similar to his thoughts on his illustration work, Wood was very comfortable creating art in a way that was more accessible for the general public. For his prints, Wood generally used the themes he had become known for: farming, the changing seasons, and small-town life. In one of these, he depicted a shrine quartet, a sort of male companion piece to the pious patriotism of Daughters of Revolution. Wood was inspired by his own experience as a member of the Freemasons to poke a little bit of fun at the ancient order of nobles of the mystic shrine by representing a quartet of earnest Midwestern singers surrounded by exotic camels and pyramids. Through this, Wood indicated the absurdity of the contrast between the members playing pseudo-mystical roles and their own lived realities. The dramatic, unnatural lighting and strong shadows created by the fez hats further enhances the dramatic contrast, while the Shriners appear earnestly engrossed in their song. In another of these prints, Wood satirizes himself in honorary degree, poking fun at the solemn ritual of pomp and circumstance. Wood was given honorary degrees by the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1936 and Lawrence College in Appleton, Wisconsin in 1938. Somewhat ironic honors, as Wood knew his appointment as an associate professor of art at the University of Iowa had been met with some skepticism, partially due to his own formal education ending with his graduation from high school. Here, a Gothic window lets in a heavenly light as a rotund Wood receives a diploma and sash, mirroring the pointed Gothic arch from two lanky academics, modeled after two of Wood's friends from the University of Iowa. Again, it is a study in contrast, as the humble farm boy receives recognition from exalted academia. He was honored to receive these accolades, but he still viewed them with a degree of amusement. These works feel akin to the illustrations Wood created for Main Street. Like Lewis, Wood's satirical figures were able to end up taking on mythic proportions, as they contributed to how different Americans thought of themselves and those around them. I'd like to end by taking a look at the book cover illustration Grant Wood created for his own book. In 1935, Wood had signed a contract with a publisher for his biography. Wood began working on the book, titled Return from Bohemia, which is also the title of the artwork, and he had help from Park Renard, his secretary and friend, who we saw previously as the model for Oliver Wiswell. He acted as his ghostwriter by writing the text based on Wood's stories. Together, they managed to complete the first section, which considered Wood's childhood up to his father's death and the family's move from Anamosa to Cedar Rapids. And though Renard and Wood would announce that the full book, would be released the next year, it was never made public. Renard used an early section for a master's thesis at the University of Iowa's English department, but that would be the only section made public. Wood had indicated that the book would go on to deal with his time as an impressionist artist, and then with his turn from a bohemian lifestyle in Paris to his personal regionalism, and his realization that only in Iowa could he reach his full potential as an American artist. This was the crucial point they emphasized, a rejection of modern painting styles in favor of an art of the Midwest. The cover illustration for Return from Bohemia presents an interesting and somewhat ambiguous study. Here, the artist depicts himself in a barnyard surrounded by people, a young boy and girl, a young man, and an older man and woman. At face level, we see Wood returned from Bohemia, now surrounded by the people who would be both his audience and his subject. This fits with how Wood often thought about his art, as Wanda Corn put it, as a, quote, public expression built on personal experiences with community and the region, end quote, that could still manage to be intelligible and meaningful to a wide audience. Oddly, that's not what we're seeing here. There is not harmony between Wood and his community. Instead, they are looking on with what he described as contempt, scorn, and an I know I could do better look. The people behind the artist have their eyes cast down or shut, not looking at Wood or the piece he works on. Wood, on the other hand, seems intensely focused, but his brow is lowered, and he seems to look up and out from under his brow, obscuring his gaze as well. It is unclear if the depiction is meant to indicate a more complex relationship between the artist and his community than he or the media had previously indicated, or if it was perhaps to draw attention to those tensions and differences between a crafted public perception of Wood's artistic persona and his actual lived reality. It's very unclear. At the same time, Wood shows himself as he would have looked in 1935, but he also wears the round tortoiseshell glasses of his impressionistic era in the 20s, rather than the wire-rimmed pair he wore in the 30s. He also uses the canvas and large brush of his earlier works. Rather than only depicting his return from Bohemia, one explanation is that Wood has compressed the time to represent both before and after his return to the region in one image, showing himself at once as the plein-air impressionistic painter with a disinterested public, and at the same time representing himself as a regionalist in a farmyard around whom people flock. This type of depiction was somewhat unusual for Wood and represents an interesting choice for the cover of a book about his life and art to represent any discord between the artist, his art, and the public. This, the piece for his own biography, feels uncharacteristic of what we expect from Wood, and perhaps that was also the point. Of the book cover illustrations that Wood created and that we've seen today, the one that he created for his own book feels the most ambiguous, made more so by not having the full text to reconcile with the description, the depiction, excuse me. It is a fascinatingly introspective work from an artist whose public persona was thought to be well understood. Today, we've seen a wide variety of Wood's book illustration art, representing the many ways he enhanced a text with his image. Thank you very much for joining me today to look at these artworks and explore them a little bit more. Please make sure to check out our other Grant Wood in Focus presentations on our YouTube channel. Thank you so much again. Bye-bye.